Good morning for me, and welcome to this week's episode. The next episode of Don't Make Me Pull Out My Books. I think we're on episode 8. This episode is going to focus on Moriarty and Irene Adler as they appear in canon and how that connects to Elementary's interpretation of Irene and Moriarty. If you have not seen the season finale for Elementary, you need to go away because you can't watch this yet. Believe me, no matter how spoiled you think you are, just go away because I don't want to be the one to accidentally ruin something for you. That would have been awesome. So, Shu, if you haven't seen it, if you have seen it, you're welcome to stick around. Though of course you may be bored by now and wandering off. So Irene Adler and Professor Moriarty are arguably two of the most important characters in the Sherlock Holmes mythos as a whole, as it has come to be in the year 2013. Interestingly enough, Irene Adler and Professor Moriarty are not really actually all that important in the canon. Between the two of them, they only appear 3 times. Irene Adler appears in Scandal of Bohemia, and Professor Moriarty appears in Final Problem and The Valley of Fear. Now, what's also interesting about Irene Adler and Professor Moriarty in this instance is that both of them never actually appear. Like, Watson never actually meets either of them. Irene Adler, he sees from a distance while Holmes is, finagling his way into her house, and they see a brief glimpse of her while she's in disguise, but Watson never actually meets Irene. Everything that we hear about Irene is via Holmes or the King. Everything. Except for one letter at the end where she gets to speak for herself. That's it. And Professor Moriarty, of course, there's that really famous conversation between Holmes and Moriarty in 221B, but that's all via Holmes. Watson never actually meets Moriarty, never actually sees Moriarty. There is a reference in Final Problem to him seeing a tall man running after the train and being told by Holmes that that's Moriarty, but nonetheless, he never actually meets Moriarty himself. So what's interesting about that, from my point of view, is that both of these characters are largely hearsay characters. The only things we know about them are through other characters, which leaves up a whole lot of room for interpretation. Of course, there has been, over the years, many theories regarding Moriarty, specifically that Moriarty was imaginary, Moriarty was innocent, blah, 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 blah. Because the canon is so open, you can make of them whatever you will, which is why Elementary choosing to make Irene and Moriarty the same person is actually not the most ludicrous interpretation of the characters ever. In fact, makes a lot more sense than you would initially think, and is also just one more in the long history of how adaptations view Irene Adler and Professor Moriarty. So I wanted to begin first of all with what we do know about Irene Adler and Professor Moriarty in the canon. Again, Irene Adler, we never see her as herself except for that one letter at the end. So here's some of the things that we learn about Irene in Scandal of Bohemia. Watson opens the narrative by saying, in his eyes, she eclipses and predominates the whole of her sex. Now, what's great about that is, of course, it was quoted in Elementary, and they did change the word sex to gender. But that isn't actually a Holmes quote. Watson quotes that saying that Holmes feels that way. We don't actually know if Holmes literally feels that way. That's Watson's interpretation of Holmes's feelings. So again, this is Irene Adler at a third removed. When they're talking to the King, here are some of the things he says about her. He says she has a soul of steel. She has the face of the most beautiful of women and the mind of the most resolute of men. And then when Holmes is talking to some of the servants and local people in where Irene lives, he says that the sentiment they express to Holmes about Irene Adler is that she is the daintiest thing under a bonnet on this planet. And then we have literally the one thing Holmes says as Holmes in the story about Irene Adler. She was a lovely woman with a face that a man might die for. That's literally the only thing that Holmes says. Everything else is via other parties to Watson. Of course, we have the whole where the sovereign came from. And the sovereign thing has actually been really interesting because he actually puts it on. He intends to put it on his watch chain before Irene Adler has beaten him in canon. He ends up having to attend the wedding between Irene Adler and Godfrey Norton, and the bride gives him a sovereign afterwards. Irene Adler gives him a sovereign afterwards to thank him in disguise. He's in disguise at this point, to thank him for attending the wedding. And then he says, the bride gave me a sovereign, and I mean to wear it on my watch chain in memory of this occasion. So I think a lot of times in a lot of adaptations and a lot of thinky thoughts, meta, we see the sovereign coming to represent, along with the photograph of Irene Adler, his defeat at the hands of Irene Adler. But the sovereign actually came before he was defeated. It was in memory of the completely absurd situation of being a detective invited to witness the wedding of the very person he's spying upon. So the sovereign can represent a lot of things, but it doesn't actually initially represent the defeat that Holmes had at the hands of Irene. But then we have the one thing that Watson says about Irene, the one thing that Watson experiences about Irene, and that's he's watching her from a distance as she takes injured priest Holmes into her house and says he was feeling guilty, blah blah blah, when I saw the beautiful creature against whom I was conspiring, or the grace and kindliness which she waited upon the injured man. So the two ways that we see Irene via our actual the people that we actually meet and see in the story, and not other third parties. We have Holmes saying she's really, really pretty, and we have Watson saying she was full of grace and really nice. So those are really the only things we have about Irene. And then, of course, the very end, the best plans of Mr. Sherlock Holmes were beaten by a woman's wit. He used to make merry over the cleverness of women, but I have not heard him do it of late. When he speaks of Irene Adler, or when he refers to her photograph, it is always under the honorable title of the woman. So that's all we get of Irene. That's her only appearance in canon. She occasionally gets a reference in other stories about, I was beaten by Irene Adler, other than Irene Adler, no woman has beaten him, blah, 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 whatever you want to say. But that's what we actually see of Irene. Now, Professor Moriarty does get a little bit more in canon, but Professor Moriarty technically appears in 2 stories rather than the 1. In terms of Moriarty's appearance, I would encourage everyone to go listen to the song Macavity from the musical Cats, because T.S. Eliot was totally ripping off Arthur Conan Doyle when he was writing about his, evil cat. So if you ever want to be able to quote what Moriarty looks like to people, just have that song going in your head and you'll be able to spit it all out. But in terms of what else we find out about Moriarty, he had a good birth, he's from a good family, excellent education, phenomenal mathematical ability, but there was a criminal strain in his blood which led him to go bad. He's involved in forgery, robberies, murders. Obviously, the famous quote, he's the Napoleon of crime. He's the organizer of half that is evil. He's a genius, a philosopher, an abstract thinker. Holmes has a lengthy paragraph where he goes on about how Moriarty doesn't really do much himself. He only plans, and then he sends out his agents to do it. He says that, an agent may be caught, but you're not going to link it back to Moriarty. In Valley of, those are all from Final Problem. In Valley of Fear, Holmes says that he's the greatest schemer of all time, the organizer of every devilry, the controlling brain of the underworld, a brain which might have made or marred the destiny of nations. Yeah, really, those are the only things that we hear about Moriarty. Again, we the reader never see Moriarty through Watson's point of view. We only hear about the conversation that is had between Moriarty and Holmes through Holmes relating it to Watson. So moving on from just what we see in canon, obviously a lot has been made of Moriarty and Irene, just from those very, very brief sketches. But because they're so brief, you open up a whole world of possibility for the characters in later adaptations. Now, of course, Elementary has a really fascinating and excellent and extremely exciting take on Moriarty and Irene by making them the same person. Now, there could be the thought that this is not good, that it's not canon, and technically, yes, of course, you're right. Irene and Moriarty were not the same person in canon, we assume. They weren't. Irene was her own person, and Moriarty was his own person. But they had a lot more in common than one might suspect, and furthermore, there's a lot in Elementary's adaptation that pulls from the canon that isn't immediately evident. For instance, Irene Adler in the story, where's my notes for her? In Scandal of Bohemia, one of the things the king says about Irene Adler is, did I not tell you how quick and resolute she was? Would she not have made an admirable queen? And of course, he's talking about, being, my wife and literally being a queen, but Irene Adler would have made a great queen, which relates very well to the concept of the Napoleon of crime. She is the queen of the underworld. She is the queen of crime. She is the Napoleon of crime. And so Irene Adler, who would have made an admirable queen, makes an admirable Napoleon of crime as well. The quote from Elementary where Irene Moriarty, whoever she is at this point, is telling Holmes, let me win, is actually a reference to canon. In Final Problem, which notes are these? Yes. In Final Problem, in the conversation that Holmes relates to Watson, Moriarty says, "This is not danger, it is inevitable destruction. You stand in the way not merely of an individual, but of a mighty organization, the full extent of which you, with all your cleverness, have been unable to realize. You must stand clear, Mr. Holmes, or be trodden underfoot." Moriarty in canon is saying, back off, dude, let me win. So that is, the Irene Moriarty saying in Elementary, let me win, is very much part of what Moriarty was telling Holmes in canon. Interestingly enough, the speech patterns that are ascribed to the professor in canon are very much the same speech patterns that Irene Adler Moriarty takes in Elementary. Moriarty is described with having a soft, precise fashion of speech, and specifically, his soft, precise fashion of speech leaves a conviction of sincerity which a mere bully could not produce. Think of that scene when Moriarty reveals herself to Holmes. She's not, yelling. She's not, flailing all over the place. She's not doing the evil cackling sort of thing. She's very clipped and precise, and she doesn't really raise her voice at all. And so that's a canon aspect that's taken into this character as interpreted by Elementary. And interestingly, there are two things. There's in canon, there's actually a connection between Moriarty and Irene. Obviously one of the most famous quotes about Irene is that she is the woman. That is her honorific. That is how she is referred to. She's there are no other women. She is the woman. Moriarty has a similar aspect to his character. In Valley of Fear, when they're talking about an inside agent that they have and how he may have cut off his message because he may have seen guilt in his eyes, or something. I don't remember the exact quote. I didn't write it down, but he may have seen something in his eyes. And either Inspector McDonald or Watson says, and by he you mean Moriarty, and Holmes says, no less, when any of that party talk about he, you know whom they mean. There is one predominant he for all of them. So both Moriarty and Irene are, emblematic of their sex or gender, whichever one we're going with. Moriarty is the he. Like, there is no other he. Moriarty is he. And Irene is the woman. So they both come to represent, they're icons. They come to represent, they're the one. And so I think that's, I mean, obviously I'm not a writer, but, to tie in, to make Irene Adler and Moriarty the same person is actually really ideal in Elementary because it is very canon connected. They become the one person, the one. They become the woman and he. I mean, think about how Elementary referred to Moriarty leading up, from episode 12 through 24. He was he. Whenever Moriarty was referred to, he was he. I mean, obviously this was because there was the sexist presumption that, of course, the king of crime had to be a man, and which is why, Irene saying as if men had a monopoly on murder is so great. But he does, Moriarty, before they know Moriarty as Irene, becomes this phantom figure that is caught up in the idea of he. So tying them together in that sense and tying those two connections together is so wonderful. And I don't think it is at all unlikely to think that the writers knew that they were not just taking two of the most iconic characters in Holmes' canon, the Holmes mythos, and making them into one, that it is in fact a canon connection itself. What else do I want to talk about? I have like a whole bunch of lists. Oh, the whole art connections. So Irene Adler is an artist. She restores paintings, and there's been a lot of great meta about how Irene Adler is really presented as in Elementary as this incredibly beautiful feminine creature, and like she embodies all that is feminine. The way she's presented, with the tumbling blonde hair, wearing white, surrounded by white, beautiful music. The way that Holmes speaks of her in the episode previous to the finale. Very soft, lovely language, and it turns out that she's stone cold and highly intellectual. And of course, there's also great meta on how the two obviously don't have to be disconnected. I mean, obviously Irene says that when she's talking to Holmes at the top of episode 24, that she brings creativity to her intellectualism, and that's why she can do what she does so well. But specifically the art reference, that is weirdly, and I didn't realize this until I was rereading Valley of Fear, that is an actual connection to Moriarty. When we get the first flashback with Irene, when they meet, and Holmes is like, that's an original. That's an original. You can't have an original. That's an original. You stole an original. That's from Valley of Fear. Again, I didn't realize that. When Holmes is trying to convince Inspector MacDonald that Moriarty is in fact the Napoleon of crime and someone that everyone should be legitimately worried about, and MacDonald says, "No, I went to see the professor, and like he was kind of nice. He was all he was avuncular. He was like He was like my uncle. He patted me on the shoulder. It was really nice." And Holmes goes, "Hey, did you happen to see that painting on the wall that he had?" And did I write? Yeah. He owns a Jean-Baptiste Greuze. I'm not. Art is not my world. Like actual physical art. Yeah. He has a Jean-Baptiste Greuze on his wall. And did you happen to see that, MacDonald? And MacDonald's like, well, yeah, I saw that. And Holmes is like, dude, that thing costs like £1 million. £1 million! Do you know what a professor makes in a year? 700. How would a professor be able to afford a Jean-Baptiste? And that's what gets MacDonald thinking that perhaps Holmes isn't off his nut, as so many of the arts seem to think he is, and that he's actually onto something. It was the art connection. And furthermore, there's actually two references in canon with Moriarty and art. When describing Moriarty to when looking at the way that the entire John Douglas Bertie Edwards plan went down in the end, and how who they're trying to figure out who would have done this, Holmes says that he knows it's Moriarty, specifically because you can tell an old master by the sweep of his brush. It's an art reference. Oh my god. Canon as hell that Irene Moriarty is an artist. Ah! I so much love for this. I didn't even realize this until I was rereading it. That's how subtle these things are. I mean, there's also a lot of other little references, like in Elementary when Joan gets a call from Orrin saying, Mom's in the hospital, can you please go see? And then as she's, walking out, Irene's like, no, I made that up. I was the one who called your brother and told him that your mom's fine. in the final problem, the way that Moriarty separates Holmes and Watson so that he can take on Holmes is by claiming that there's a medical emergency with an Englishwoman back in the village that at the hotel that they're staying at. Now, interestingly, in this adaptation, Moriarty used a medical emergency to separate Holmes and Watson, not to get to Holmes in this instance, but to get to Watson, which I think is great because it's a very literary, symbolic connection to what actually goes down in the problem in the final problem. You know, Moriarty separates Holmes away because and it ends up leading to his death. He meets with the character who ends up, being being the one to overtake him and topple him and win. In Elementary, Irene separates Watson and completely discounts Watson in the process, but it ends up being Watson who overthrows Moriarty in the end. So those are just some of the. Oh no! I have one more. The concept of male costume. Where's that quote? In Scandal of Bohemia, Irene Adler says in her letter, literally the only time she gets to speak, and it's in a letter, male costume is nothing new to me. I often take advantage of the freedom which it gives. Now let's look at that in terms of Elementary. Moriarty becomes almost a male costume for Irene Adler, not in the sense of, Moriarty is probably the dominant, mask here because, Moriarty takes on the persona of Irene in order to get to Holmes. But in terms of when it comes to talking to other people, Irene says she uses a guy, one of her lieutenants, to talk to people who she thinks wouldn't be able to handle her gender or to play, and so he plays the role for people who wouldn't be able to handle her gender. She adopts a male disguise via another person, mind you, but still adopts a male disguise for the freedom which it gives. In order to enact all of her plans, she has to use a man because, God forbid that a woman be good at something. God forbid that a woman be in charge. And she recognizes that, and it's specifically called out, both in canon, where Irene says, yeah, I can't get into certain spaces because I'm a woman, and in Elementary, where Moriarty, despite being the top and the best, has to use a lieutenant to play the role for her at times. So that's a really interesting, that's a true adaptation. That is someone going, what would this look like in the modern era? Irene could, be wandering around dressed as a man. That would be fine. She, it's still, that's not something that's, strictly left behind in the Victorian era. But it is a twist on the concept of male costuming that is canon related. So those are some of the most basic connections that I have between Irene and Moriarty and Elementary's mixing of the two. I've spoken on my Tumblr page. Well, I wrote 2 sentences on my Tumblr page in reaction to the concept of Holmes losing to Irene, but Moriarty still losing because of Watson. One of the things that we have seen so much in adaptations over the years is an Irene Adler who ends up losing to Holmes. I'm thinking specifically, of course, I'm breaking all my rules. I'm going to be talking about other adaptations in this video. I'm going to try and stay away from any, specifically negative comments, because I do respect other adaptations' rights to be, and I appreciate other adaptations and enjoy them on their own level. But specifically, Irene loses, like hardcore loses in BBC Sherlock. And I'm sorry, I don't care about all those arguments about how ultimately she won because she made Sherlock Holmes have a feeling. Don't get me started on that. But yeah, Irene Adler loses in BBC Sherlock. In the RDJ films, I'm not entirely sure, she kind of wins and she kind of loses because she does beat Holmes, and, but we never actually see that defeat. That's considered in the past. Granada Holmes is very, very, very canonical. You can't, if you're looking for the canon adaptation, you're just going to go to Granada. It's all hail Granada. I don't think we get an Irene Adler in the Rathbone films, honestly. I know that we get one in the Christopher Lee films, but I honestly haven't seen those recently enough to remember. I know that we get an Irene Adler in the Matt Frewer films, but I don't remember if she wins or loses in that. I know that we get, and I feel like we get an Irene Adler in the Russian films. I think in Sign of 4, maybe? But I just don't recall. I mean, bad me, I should have sat down and watched those already, but I do have a life outside of Sherlock Holmes. It may not seem like it, but I do. So there has tended to be, though, in various adaptations, a tendency for Irene Adler to not be the ultimate winner in this contest between Holmes and Irene, and the fact that Holmes still loses to Irene Adler is great, because here's the thing about Irene Adler and Moriarty. Irene wins, Moriarty loses. When you make them into the same character, you have to figure out a way to reconcile the two. So they stayed true to the canon and were finally good, decent to Irene, in that Irene got to win against Holmes. But Moriarty still had to lose in some way. Well, that's where Watson came in. So Watson was the one who beat Moriarty, Irene, whichever one you want to call her at that point. I think that's great. I think it's takes the two disparate ways of the ending of the ending fate of those two characters, where one has to win and one has to lose, and when you put them into one character, you're like, well fuck, catch-22. Well, no, Elementary handled that in an excellent, superb, delightful way. So there's that. I think it's important to note that I don't think that necessarily that Irene Moriarty has actually lost, maybe just been stymied for a little bit. I'm thinking of the movie that I just watched, Sherlock Holmes and the Baker Street Irregulars. In that story, Irene is the big villain. Spoiler alert, Irene's the big villain in Sherlock Holmes and the Baker Street Irregulars. And she gets caught at the end, and then at the very, very end of the film, we see her sneaking off in costume and walking away after having been captured by the police. So I think we're going to be looking at a very similar thing with Irene Moriarty in Elementary, in that temporarily defeated, but not actually. She lost the battle. She hasn't lost the war. A couple of other things I wanted to mention. In adaptations, we've really seen this growing idea that Holmes and Moriarty are the same person. They're two sides of the same coin. I find that really intriguing, because that has become the interpretation. It's not necessarily true to canon. I mean, the most that Holmes really says is that Moriarty is an intellectual equal, someone, my horror at his crimes is lost in my admiration of his skill, or whatever the exact quote is. I don't have it written down. So, Holmes recognizes Moriarty as an intellectual equal, but over many, many years it has become this concept of, they are the same person, they're just working on different sides of the fence. What's really fascinating about that, in my eyes, is that, no, actually, the Holmes that you really want to compare to Moriarty is Mycroft. Mycroft, in a lot of the ways that Moriarty described, would be a more apt comparison. I'm thinking specifically, if I can find my notes. Here they go. In the quote that I read earlier from Valley of Fear, the greatest schemer of all time, the organizer of every devilry, the controlling brain of the underworld, a brain which might have made or marred the destiny of nations. Now think about how Mycroft is described by Holmes, that he is the British government, he's the clearinghouse. People come to him because he can take all these facts and make them into a clear path. I think that although it makes an excellent story for Holmes and Moriarty to basically be the same person, just one working for justice and one working for injustice and crime, it's actually more accurate to say that Mycroft and Moriarty in canon are similar. And what's, oh my god, so amazing about that is that in canon, Holmes recognizes Mycroft as his superior in intellect, and in Elementary, when when they take on this very much created idea of, Holmes and Moriarty being the same, when Holmes in Elementary says, "So you're saying we're the same?" No, no, no. Moriarty says, "Oh no, I'm better. I'm saying I'm better," which is great because, again, it's that canon connection. When you look at Moriarty and Mycroft and Holmes stripped of all the years of interpretation and scholarship, you see that Mycroft and Moriarty have more in common, really. Even to the point, where Moriarty doesn't do anything himself. He lets everybody else do it. Mycroft can't be bothered to, alter his little orbit between Pall Mall and the Diogenes Club. I mean, like, really. But anyway, so getting back to, once you strip away all the interpretations over the years, and you just look at canon, and then you translate that into Elementary, the idea of Irene saying, "No, I'm saying I'm better," is very apt and accurate if you consider the fact that Moriarty has more in common with Mycroft, who was, in Holmes's own words, intellectually superior to himself. So, oh my god, all that canon in like 2 episodes, and like canon that not only, interacts with canon, but interacts with years upon years upon years of interpretation and scholarship and, adaptation distillation, to use the term from TV tropes that I, love. I mean, they really deconstructed not just various tropes. I mean, there's lots of meta out there that I would really encourage you to read about the various tropes that Elementary, looks at and goes, let's see all the ways that we can take this apart and point out how problematic it is. But it also looks at all of these years of Holmes scholarship and goes, yes, but is that what canon actually said, or is that what we have made of it? And then they take that apart, but at the same time join into the chorus of interpretation over the years by bringing their own interpretation. Was that the only thing? Oh, I did want to discuss briefly Irene as a love interest. I know a lot of people were dismayed that Irene was, yet again, a love interest, although in a completely new and exciting way in a lot of ways, since she was totally playing Holmes the entire time. Irene as a love interest has, I think, unfortunately become so much a part of our cultural interpretation of Irene that it's going to be really difficult for her to ever get out from underneath that umbrella, unless you're looking at an adaptation that is literally just trying to bring canon to life. So I'm thinking of course, the Granada series and the radio series starring Clive Merrison, written by Bert Coules. Both of those series work really, really hard to just, make canon 3D rather than be interpretations. Whereas I think most other adaptations, pastiches, what have you, really are looking at finding a new angle to canon, which is fine. I mean, either approach just gives us more Holmes, and that's all I really care about. Give me all the Holmes. But unless you're looking at Granada and the BBC radio plays by Bert Coules, you're going to find, I think, unfortunately, a lot of Irene as the love interest. And I don't know where that originated, technically speaking, because Holmes scholarship really began shortly after the Holmes stories began, and I just don't have access to all of, to read all those essays, nor do I have time to read, years upon years of Baker Street Irregular journals and what have you. However, I can say that one of the most obvious and one of the older origins of Irene as a love interest comes from the W.S. Baring Gould biography of Sherlock Holmes called Sherlock Holmes of Baker Street, in which Irene Adler is not only a love interest, but she and Holmes have a kid together, and that kid turns out to be Nero Wolfe. So this is so, like, oh, God bless you, Baring Gould, for all of your crack theories that you gifted to those of us in the Sherlock Holmes fandom. We thank you. But because it is so ingrained, I mean, I run into people all the time who genuinely think that Irene Adler has always been a love interest. So I think it's going to be incredibly difficult for us to ever see an Irene Adler in an adaptation rather than just a pure canon-connected story like Granada or the Bert Coules radio plays that is true to her original self. Personally, I think that Elementary's version of Irene did a whole hell of a lot better. both in terms in either of her personas. I think, it was a hell of a lot better and a hell of a lot more canon connected than some other interpretations that we've seen that make me want to claw my eyes out. In terms of Moriarty and adaptations over the years, I think I think one of my favorite Moriartys is from the Rathbone films. I think Moriarty appears in three of the Basil Rathbone films, and in at least two of them that I can recall. I'm sorry, I love this so much. And in at least two of the Basil Rathbone films that I can recall, Moriarty meets his demise at the end by falling off of something. I'm sorry, every single time I watch those films and watch Moriarty fall off something, I'm like, I know it's meant to be a reference to Reichenbach Falls, but I just want to be like, Moriarty, dude, just stay away from high stuff. Stay on the ground floor and you might be okay. Don't go near banana peels. But, that's a canon connected, it is a canon connection that needs to be recognized, even if it's fucking hysterical. I think the Moriarty that we see in Robert Downey Jr. is fairly appropriate. He's a schemer who's working to make himself a shit ton of money in the weapons trade by sparking a war. I don't really have a lot to say about BBC Sherlock's interpretation of Moriarty. You know what? Actually, I do. The thing that strikes me, I like their Moriarty well enough, but what strikes me about that Moriarty is that in canon, Moriarty has a crap ton of minions. Literally, he sits behind a desk and just sends people out. But BBC Sherlock, we don't really see any minions. We see the cab driver in the very first episode, although I would argue that that's less a minion and more a guy who had his own vendetta. And we have Irene, and that's really it. So, the BBC Sherlock's version of Moriarty is very much a solitary character, in which case makes sense for, saying that Moriarty and Sherlock are the same within that adaptation, because their Moriarty is very solitary, and their Sherlock is very, very, very solitary. So in that case, it makes a lot of sense, but it isn't necessarily true to canon. Granada's Moriarty Granada's just so true to canon. It is so much an extension of canon that it's very hard to, make a lot of grand sweeping statements about it, because you're also going to be making grand sweeping statements about canon. But they do expand Moriarty's role just a little bit. He turns out to be the planner in a red-headed league, and then we also see the case in France that took Holmes away from Watson and London, as mentioned at the beginning of the final problem. So we don't see a lot more of Moriarty, but we do get a slight expansion. Now, Elementary's Moriarty, obviously, we do get a couple of cases that are shown to be part of Moriarty's grand scheme, but we meet more agents of Moriarty. I honestly think that in this adaptation of canon, we finally get the general idea of this vast network that Moriarty has built. There are so many fucking agents that we meet. My God, and who knows? Because they played it so well. Who knows if there's not other agents that we're unaware of presently? There's so many, and that's so excellent. And I read someone saying that, Irene couldn't really have been Moriarty because Moriarty was the person who sat back and sent other people for him, and it would not make sense for Irene to be caught in the end by visiting Holmes in the hospital, which, yes, it's a stupid villain move to make. However, it's also true to canon, because in canon, if you'll recall, they meet up at Reichenbach Falls to have their big final showdown, and Moriarty had Moran with him the entire fucking time in canon. They were hunting them the entire time. They shoved some rocks down at them at some point. They were there the entire time while Holmes and Watson were off tromping through various wildernesses. God, reminds me of Harry Potter Book 7. And nothing happened to them at that point other than a slight rock slide. It wasn't until Moriarty had to get Holmes alone. This is a stupid villain move that has been going on since 1891. I mean, just Moriarty could have sniped Holmes at any time while they were wandering around in the various parts of the continent. And he didn't, because Moriarty wanted to get Holmes alone. So that in elementary, when Irene Moriarty goes to see Holmes in the hospital bed, you may argue, and you may argue very well and very reasonably, that, it's a dumbass move, and you'd be right. And it's also a dumbass move that happens in canon, because, dude, Moriarty could have taken out Holmes at any fucking time and didn't, because he had to go stand at the edge of a cliff to have their confrontation. Just, Moriarty, stay on the ground floor, avoid banana peels, and you'll be good. So I think that's really the extent that I have to talk about in terms of Irene and Moriarty. Those are at least my big notes. I'm sorry that this has been so disorganized. I've been awake now for an hour, given that this video is about 40 minutes long. And so yeah, I apologize for how jagged it is, but largely I just want to say that this interpretation of Irene and Moriarty was superb and so canon I could cry. Like, I'm still having, crying fits over the finale, and it's, Sunday? It's the Sunday after it aired, and I'm still, just find myself wanting to fling myself to the ground, because it's so good in terms of just good storytelling. I mean, it is excellent, excellent storytelling to begin with, but it's also excellent storytelling that finds its roots and canon. And frankly, the only thing you ever need to do to make this fangirl excited is to have canon connections that are done in incredibly good ways, and it was, and I'm just so excited that our Irene is Moriarty and got her ass handed to her by a woman of color. How fucking awesome is that? Ah! Okay, I'm done. So yes, thank you for watching this episode of Don't Make Me Pull Out My Books. I'm sorry that it was a bit of a long one. I didn't think to split it up. I'm hoping you all have a lovely day, and I will see you when now that the season is ended. I have so many things that I could do now in terms of looking at canon, so I don't know when I'll see you next. It'll happen when I, actually get something organized. See you later. Bye-bye.